Looking Glass, starring Nicolas Cage, tells the story of a new motel owner who finds out that his motel has a sinister past, filled with voyeurism and murder. But the story of how it finally got made 20 years after it was written is a little bit stranger. Jerry Rapp, writer, Looking Glass.
I had a really great break out of college, which was I sold a script very early on to Imagine and Ron Howard. Got a 2-picture development deal out of that. Worked with a partner for a while through the trenches and started to veer more toward, because I'm sure people have told this to you over and over, how you get frustrated with that glacial movement of the studios and all the trappings that entails. So I started to get more interested in the independent things that nobody would give me too much trouble on creatively. There's a different trade-off for that, which is that it's even harder to get a film made and raise the money. But that was always my interest. And so this film came out of the milieu of that, of the reaction to the studio films and the frustration creatively I was feeling with that, and putting it all into these little indie things that I was sure nobody would ever make. I thought somebody someday would make it, and I was holding on to it kind of as a pet project. You know, it was a 20-plus year project, and it sort of came out of that whole traveling around, writing about different things. And so I didn't think that it wouldn't get made. I just thought the right person would have to come along and make it. I was reading a lot about the different ways motels were spying on people at the time, and people were using infrared devices to see if they could see if there was things behind mirrors and things like that. There were different tips on holding a flashlight up to a mirror in a certain way, and you can see if there's peepholes. I would check into motels and hold the mirrors back slightly to make sure that there were no holes. And I was watching a lot of documentaries about that at the time. There was a very, very famous 2020 documentary that was a hugely viewed one about peepholes that were being discovered in motels. It was just that really simple premise, and just how it affects a man's psyche, discovering that ability to look in on someone's world. It just started fascinating me, and the script was something that I was just dabbling in over the years. Even though it wasn't being made, I just kept putting things into it and being re-inspired by it and dusting it off every year or two to just kind of update it and tighten it. So I wouldn't recommend that everybody's work has to take 20 years. Sometimes when you do put details into things and just take a lot of care with them, somebody will eventually see it, and its time will come, and it's in its way. It went in and out of various ways. It almost got made for one reason or another. Different companies at different points were interested in it. It had a variety of people attached to it at one point. It was one of those things where every time I would be in some sort of crossing of any person who I felt was supposed to be the lead in the movie, I'd find some way to try to get it to them. At one point, I went to see a play in L.A. The script was in my car because I had been meeting with somebody about it, and I'd made 2 copies, and one was a fresh, beautiful copy. Somebody said, "Do you want to come see a play with me?" And I went, and it was a play starring Ed Harris. And suddenly I was sitting about 2 feet from Ed Harris, and I felt like he was making eye contact with me and stuff. So when the play ended, I ran out to my car, grabbed the script. I hope he's not still mad about this, by the way. But I went out to my car, and I grabbed the script, and I ran in, and people were kind of gathered around him after the play. And I walked up to him, and he was looking at me, and he said, "Yeah, what are you all about?" Because my eyes were obviously boring into him. And so I said, "Well, I ran out to my car because we've been talking about this movie, and I really want you to play the lead. I was hit with something while I was watching this play." He asked me to start talking about it. I felt like I was actually doing pretty well with him, talking about it and interesting him. And then I decided to make a bad joke because he had just gotten off the film The Abyss, and this play was kind of his breather. And he hated being on that movie, apparently. And so I tried to make a bad joke, and at the end of it, I kind of said, "Yeah, and it all takes place underwater." And he just gave me a look that can, melt steel, and said something, and then basically, that was it. The film went through so many almost getting made that it was kind of par for the course. Nick got on board. The producer of the film worked with Nick on a film called The Trust. Braxton Pope at some point had discussed the film with him, and Nick showed interest in reading it, and it went from there. Essentially, the time frame was very curious because a friend of mine about 2 weeks prior to that had called and said, "I'm looking for something that takes place in the desert, and it can be a Western or a thriller or what have you." I sent him that, and we were prepared to make this film for under $1 million. and he had an investor interested in that point, but it wouldn't have been obviously a cast like Nick or anybody. So we were going to make that film, and then Braxton kind of called me out of the blue, and he had a long-term knowledge of this film because we've known each other from quite some time, and said he had an opportunity to make the film, and he said, yeah, I've got some interest from somebody, and I said, oh, who's that? And he said, well, I gave it to Nick to read. I didn't know if Nick was his producer friend or not, and I said, oh, Nick, who's Nick? And he said, oh, Cage, you know. And so he kind of should have led with that, like a journalist leads with a hook, you know. But anyway, that was really good news. So then I had to make that very painful decision of do I make the low key festival film, or do I somehow get one of my heroes to say my lines? It was very interesting decision. But did I ever not think it was not going to get made? Not really. I always thought it would get made. I just didn't know how.
Tim Hunter, director, Looking Glass.
It came onto my radar through the producer, Braxton Pope, who sent it to me. Nick was already attached to it. They had tried to make it a year before with some other people, and it had fallen apart over the rewrite that Nick didn't like. No, I never saw the previous version. I guess whoever was supposed to direct it did some kind of major rewrite at the last minute, and Nick didn't like it, so it fell apart. When Braxton gave me the current script that Nick had agreed to do, the condition was that I do that script and not rewrite it. It did need some work. There was some agreement on Nick's part that the ending needed work, so we did work on the script some, but consulting Nick all along the way to make sure he was okay with it. You know, he showed up a few days before we started. I actually met him on the set, the motel where we shot most of the picture. You know, gave him a tour of the geography of the place. We talked about the character. He had a beard. He was going to keep it, and clearly was going to keep it. And I think that he wanted my assurance that I was going to shoot the script that he had approved, because he'd done a fair amount of prep on it at that point. He's very dedicated, and he knew what he was doing. He wanted to make sure I wasn't going to, try to push it in some other direction with a lot of new material that he wasn't prepared to learn. I tend to keep things fairly calm and underplayed. One of the things he liked about it was a chance to play a performance in a lower key than the ones he had been doing on either end of this picture. You know, people have pushed him in a fairly histrionic, over-the-top, people say, direction. And this was the opposite of that. It was a very nuanced performance. I wasn't keeping him from it, but the part gave him an opportunity to play in a lower register, make it a little bit more of a nuanced performance, a low-key performance, that's all. You know, I wasn't trying to pull him down. It was the part, which I think he enjoyed. As I say, he really knew the part and what he wanted to do with it, which was great. You know, so at the same time that I was directing him, I was watching him, you know, with a fair amount of admiration to what he was going to bring to it. And often in that kind of a situation where, especially when you're on a tight schedule, you know, an actor comes up to you and says, "Oh, what are we doing today?" Or "What's this scene? Remind me." And I would kind of lay it out for him. And my thing is always, often not so much to tell an actor what to do, but just to open up the alternatives that the character that the actor is playing might be feeling, and just expand the range, you know, of choices that the actor had. And we worked very well together, I think. And sometimes I would tell him how I thought it would go, or, you know, how I had imagined it myself, you know, and he would say, "Oh, yeah, I can do that. And, you know, he would just get it. And other times he probably had his kind of touchstones that meant more to him than others in the script, where he was very, you know, he knew very concretely what he wanted to do with it. There's a scene where between him and the cop in the motel office, where the cop kind of creeps him out, and all of a sudden the cop turns to him and says, "Did you do it?" referring to murder that had taken place. And Nick gets all flustered, and the cop keeps needling him, and Nick keeps saying sort of, who me, what are you talking about? And that was something that Nick and Mark Lucas had worked out, and they ad-libbed it. They kind of popped it on me. I thought it was great. We shot a couple of alternate takes and stuff, but I knew that I would use it because it just came out of left field, and it was spontaneous and creepy and funny. I'm always kind of looking for the laughs, the sort of dark laughs, the black comedy aspect of a piece like this. And Nick has a lot of experience in that realm also. So I think, that Nick would play this stuff where he had to acknowledge that the character he was playing was pretty fucked up. And then he would just burst out laughing, at how fucked up the guy was. I didn't have to direct him very much. I was more concerned with the what he was looking at. And I don't know, it was because we were shooting in Utah. The producer, who was a Salt Lake City-based guy, was concerned about nudity, and there wasn't any mandate to cast actresses who would do full nudity, which was fine with me. And contractually these days, you have to spell everything out in advance, how much you're going to show, what you're going to show, so we got it to a point where the actresses were comfortable, but I think the writer anyway felt that it should have been more graphic, the sex scenes. But Nick did his thing. In the second scene, I think he plays it that he sort of starts to masturbate, which was funny. He feels, I think, that because the audience always expects him to, somewhere or other in a picture, go a little further than anybody expects him to push the envelope a little bit. There were a few places, looking through the glass, and a few other places where where he just pushed it a little further than naturalism would normally dictate. Maybe when he starts to masturbate, or just his expressions. But I'm thinking more like he was very fond of a scene where the woman who, I never really think of her as a hooker, but the woman who's the kind of bondage woman who initiates the sex scenes comes in to rent a room, and he's kind of smitten with her, and and he tells her that he'll have coffee there for her in the morning and stuff. And it's all just a little bit more than it would be in real life, but it's kind of deliciously funny at the same time. It was just small things, but he really kept a lid on it. He knew where he wanted to push the envelope, and it was always in a very nuanced way for this particular part. So I just loved working with him.
Cage is one of those amazingly chameleon actors that there is no equivalent to. That was the thrill, really, to just think. I had a Sailor Ripley on my guitar case for most of my life, and I did enjoy interacting with him quite a bit. There wasn't much of it, and I don't want to come off as that like he and I were buds, but we did have a simpatico, and we kind of kept out of his way, like the 800-pound gorilla he is, and you don't want to make eye contact with a method person or anything like that you might throw off or what's going on for them. So about the third day in, we came in, and I was sitting behind Tim, and we were looking at takes on the monitor. Nick was up to his brilliance, and I hadn't really spoken to him yet. He'd kind of given me a sideward glance or two, but I didn't think he noticed I existed, and I didn't want him to. Suddenly he comes kind of barreling into the room to Tim, and he says, "I want to change a line or two here. Can I do something to give it a different meaning?" And Tim goes, "Well, the writer's back there. Why don't you ask him?" And he said, "Writer? Where?" And I heard that, and my heart kind of stopped. I thought he was going to come and yell at me. Tim kind of points back to me, and Nick comes back, and he goes, "Man, I just wanted to tell you that it was great. That it was it's a great script, and you left me more questions than answers, and I like how things unfolded." And he talked for me for like 2 minutes, and you could hear a pin drop in the room because the whole place stopped until he finished. And it was a really great moment for me. It was just profoundly moving, and I appreciate that he took the time to engage, because there's an unpredictable uncomfortability when you come onto a set and you're the writer and nobody knows how to act around you. But he was amazing and really kind. And so anyway, he finished his great compliment, and everybody's looking at me like, what am I going to say? And I said, "Thanks, you made my decade." And he laughed and just went back to work. Just the surreal aspect of Tim Hunter, was so influential on me as a filmmaker, and just being there with him and having Nick out a few feet away doing the lines in the middle of Kanab, Utah, of all places, it just hit me with this surreal feeling of, you know how you stop and think about moments that you just kind of, it all sums up to where you are in a certain place. Just kind of examine your life at some point and go, how did this all happen? This is a series of completely random circumstances. I also remember very vividly that I loved that Nick had a penchant for spiders and scorpions and was really fascinated by insects. Always had a childlike fascination for insects. There's a scene in the film where there's a praying mantis, and the praying mantis crawls across the mirror. And just, he was contemplating how various things could crawl across the mirror. So that night I went and wrote 3 scenes that that could be alternative bugs, or alternative things that could crawl across the mirror and mean various things. And his makeup person was amazing and so amazing to us. And she said, "Do you want me to just walk those into Nick?" So I gave those to him, and I looked up, and as he was getting them, when I was passing by, and he was just smiling and he was waving these at me. Like, it was great.
For more information on the origin of Looking Glass, check out The Weird Part of Looking Glass, All of It, by Jerry Rapp, writing for the blog Go Into the Story, the official blog of The Blacklist.